Thank you, Paul. Thanks to Stuart for coming along. Thanks for coming along as well. Hopefully there'll be an interesting discussion. There's certainly a lot of ground to cover. It's a very broad topic. But I'm going to start off by asking Stuart how he first took an interest in this area. What first grabbed your attention on this front?
Well, I've got a bit of a... Can you hear me at the back, all right? I'll project, right? So if I start to mumble, just wave at me.
Project.
Yeah. Well, I've got a bit of a ramble for this, so just bear with me. So I'm from the left in terms of politically, and I would still say, I mean, I suppose a part of the problem today is that I don't think left and right helps define the problems that we face. So on any issue that I'm interested in, I don't think it's that useful. So something like freedom of speech is something that historically people who are radical and liberal would have been strong defenders of, whereas today I find myself in a curious situation where, you know, my colleagues in the sociology division are kind of split on this. All would probably say they're defenders of freedom of speech, but as soon as you prod them a little bit, less so. But my journey through this, I suppose, my first piece of substantial work was when I started to look at New Labour's policies on curfews in Hamilton, just outside Glasgow. I lived in Glasgow for nearly 20 years before, and I lived in Dundee, from Newcastle originally. And I went to the schools there. Very kindly, the schools allowed me to go in and interview the kids from the area where they were going to introduce a curfew. And I suppose thinking about it, the reason I was concerned about this, I was a youth worker and community worker in Edinburgh and Dundee. But I wasn't really concerned about it because I'm concerned about the kids so much. I think my concern was that I could see a trend towards what I would describe as the regulation of everyday life. So whether that's in public or increasingly whether that's in private, in more and more areas of our lives there seems to be a presumption that you need what I'd say, in fact it's interestingly if you ever work for a council, you have support and supervision. Any of you've worked for a council, so that's what you go to see your boss. You don't just have supervision, you have support and supervision, which I think is kind of interesting. They're there to support you, because it often support and supervision often ends up being, they'll ask you about your personal life. How are you? You know, they have to ask you, how are you? That's part of being a proper manager, whether it's in a school or you must have experienced this, or workplace. You have to have support and supervision, which is interesting because it almost becomes that your private life is becoming a public entity, and vice versa, that a public body like institutions start to become almost not privatised so much, but there seems to be a confusion of roles, which I think that is a thing today, about a definite theme, that there is a confusion of roles. Institutions don't appear to recognise clearly what they're for, and there seems to be a crossover of these things. So, for example, teachers become more like parents, parents are expected to be more like teachers, and so on. You seem to have this crossover, this confusion taking place. Anyway, so I suppose safety was a big theme. So my favourite sociologist is a guy called Frank Furedi, old Marxist from the 70s, 80s, 90s. I'm not sure what he would call himself now, similarly as I don't know what I would call myself now. But he wrote a book called The Culture of Fear, which the opening line of the first edition said, safety has become the absolute value of our time. And that, I suppose, was an interesting concern that I had, that safety and the presumption of a lack of safety and the need to help people to be safe. So that was the sort of criminological theme. The interest was this issue of safety at the time. And one of my big concerns looking at the area that I was looking at, but more generally, was the extent to which relationships between people that historically would have been regulated between themselves were becoming regulated by the state. So, for example, there was adverts at the time about antisocial behaviour, where they were saying, if there is trouble with your noisy neighbour or kids on the street, pick up a weapon, and the weapon in question was a telephone. So instead of you going outside your front door and dealing with young people from your street, you're expected to phone the council or phone the police. And for me, this was helping to, it was predicated already on a diminishing of trust between people and a diminishing of collectivity. So whether that's conservative, collective frameworks of nation, frameworks of class and politics, I think that it was diminishing already. But what New Labour did was to presume that was the nature of the world, and to start to create more and more mechanisms whereby instead of people actually relating to each other, they started to relate to each other through a third party. And that, I suppose, was a big concern, just even in terms of thinking about how an individual develops to become a more robust human, or how a community develops. It's through relating to other people. It's through dealing with the kids, dealing with your neighbours, dealing with things. That's how I think people develop, how communities develops, and how norms develop as well. So that was a major concern at the time. So from there, I started to look at the issue of cotton wool kids, which was, again, this was about the idea that children need to be kept hyper safe. And in particular, these little things that developed. So I would try and set up little campaigns, sort of little one-man campaigns, or more, 2 or 3. I helped set up a group called Generation Youth Issues, which was sort of a research group with like-minded people. And so one of the issues we looked at, for example, which is a silly one, although I was at a swimming pool the other day and listening to the interactions someone went in with their children. But you know, you have safe swimming policies now, and you even have little pictures, and it's the little pictures show the size of the children, and it's like armbands and a ratio of adults to children. So, for example, if you are a lone parent, or if you just go with your children under a certain age, they won't let you into the swimming pool because there has to be a certain regulation of what is safe. So they don't presume that you as a parent might actually care about your children and want to keep them safe. There is a sort of there's a sliding scale of safety. And to the extent that one of the community groups I was working with in Edinburgh had taken a minibus, or it might have been a bus load of children, and in the end there was about 25 of them. In the end, they weren't allowed in the swimming pool because the exact ratio of number of adults to number of children at a certain age wasn't correct, so they couldn't go swimming. Another little campaign that I did was about photography, taking photographs at nativity plays and at schools, which did actually happen to me as well. I'm not going to the story about it, but the general idea is a concern that the presumption was better safe than sorry. You know, I'm not saying you're all paedophiles. I'm not saying any of you are paedophiles, but images of children, you don't know where they'll end up. So please, for the safety of everybody, just because you can put your cameras away and so on. Which I just found mind-boggling in terms of the depravity and the representation of the adults in the room in relation to the children, and the way that safety was becoming obsessive, because that isn't actual policy, that's not law, that was when schools started to presume too much. But similarly, a colleague I was working with described, shows my lack of religious knowledge, but when Catholic kids go to their first communion, or whatever it is when they're young, But similarly, the priest would say, please, could you put your cameras away? You know, when there's the kids all dressed up and everything. And it's so horrible, so anti-human, and yet so accepted as a framework. So these were some of the concerns that I had at the time, and I actually got, which I hadn't realised at the time, that Christine, some of you might have heard of Christine Hoff Sommers, who's an American woman. I actually got her over to speak, flew her over from America, managed to raise a bit of funding, and had a little conference in Hamden with Frank Farade. He was speaking. I think she came over because she wanted to meet Frank Farade, if I'm honest, but I don't care. It was probably more of a coup than I realised at the time, as there was just this like setting up a little conference to have a discussion about what was happening with adults and children around this Cottonwool Kids theme. And one of the conclusions that we were trying to draw from that was there was a problem of what we called adult solidarity. So historically, adults and children were recognised as there was something different. And so if someone had come to my parents' door when I was a child and complained about me, an adult, my mother would presume, or if a teacher, if I went home and said to my mother, Mr. Smart told me off today, my mother would have said, well, you must have done something wrong. And she might have then had a word with Mr. Smart and said something else to Mr. Smart. But with me, she would have felt that there was a need to hold the line. There was a certain sense of adult solidarity. Whereas today, again, part of a more fragmenting society, I think we end up in a situation where we become much more defensive, much more insular in relation to our children. And criticism of our children feels like criticism of us. And we become much more defensive and are more inclined to side with the child rather than with the adult. So that was a theme that developed out of this. And I suppose the new Labour framework was of interest more generally in terms of socialisation, or what I termed, I wrote a paper on the anti-socialisation of children, which was attempting to understand how children are socialised and to try and look at how increasingly in different areas, whether it's in schools or in different areas of life, there was a professional getting involved. So rather than there being informal interactions or even personal interactions with the teacher and a child, there was rules, there was a framework. There were things like touch policies. So there are touch policies now if you work in nurseries and so on that explain to you how to touch a child correctly. And through the process of doing that, it kind of problematizes touch. It raises touch into something else. It starts to confuse it. It starts to degrade the relationship between the professional and the child. It starts to make them think about themselves in terms of, I've got to protect myself. So the irony is the interest of the child doesn't actually become the interest of the child. It becomes the interest of you covering your back because you follow a certain policy, and so on. So these type of issues started to become of interest to me. Similar to things like relationship education. I wrote a chapter about relationship education, where we were having a shift from sex education, which you could say is problematic in itself, but nevertheless now moving towards relationship education, and a situation where the most intimate part and private part of a young person's life was again starting to be colonised by professionals. So I was interested in that. Parenting classes obviously then become interesting, and we have to illustrate the extent to which this has become normal now. I think because a lot of people think, oh, it's the SNP or it's Labour, it's a leftist thing and all the rest of it. But it was David Cameron, as leader of I think he was Prime Minister at the time, who said it was every decent parent, a responsible parent, should think that they should have parenting classes. and that was David Cameron. So that, I just thought that's a really good example of the extent to which the idea of professional support for people start to expand. And then linked to that, of course, the named person emerged, which I suppose is really how I ended up more particularly getting interested in issues of the family to a certain extent.
So stick with that for the named person. What are your specific concerns with that, and have they been allayed with being struck down in the High Court?
Yeah, well, just I'll tell this just because this is absolutely true and odd, which is probably about 13 years ago now. I thought about writing a novel, which you know this. And that it was a futuristic novel based in America, where America had split into two camps. One that was a very one like today, I suppose, like all the worst aspects of the modern world. And elsewhere, there were people who weren't that keen on intervention. So the basis of the book was the idea that as soon as you had a child, you would be given a support worker who would live in your house, right? And if you were a correct thinking person, you would think that this was great because, you know, parenting, as Obama has said, as Blair has said, as Cameron has said, is the hardest job in the world. So how can you possibly do the hardest job in the world by yourself without expert support? Right? Because we all know that we need expert support. And so this was the basis of the idea, and half the society had reacted to this, this idea that they should have a support worker living with them. And ironically, the part of the group who I imagined would be opposed to this was a group that were called the Family Party. This is absolutely true, absolutely true. Right, so the people I imagined...
Did the leader have a name?
Well, there are names in it. Yeah. I mean, I wrote half this stuff. And it's true, so my imagination were that there would be hippies who were a bit libertarian, who were annoyed about this. There were Christians, there were old Marxists, all sorts of groups, more traditional groups. And the organising framework for how this developed was this thing called the Family Party. And then, 10 years later, the SNP invents the named person. And so my concerns about the named person are, I think, fairly clear, I think, from what I've just suggested. One of the key things I think that is remarkable in terms of the extent to which this is lost in policy discussions is the understanding of the importance of autonomy. And autonomy, and I think about that in many, many different ways in terms of people's relationship with the public, but also key obviously, is in terms of the family and people's ability to have genuine private space where they can develop as people and they are free. It seems to be a very straightforward, essential thing. And a major change that was being promoted through the named person was this discussion about well-being. I mean, I'm assuming people here know the named person. So there's the framework is one in relation to well-being, which again I wrote a paper specifically trying to look at this this concept and this idea, which is extremely problematic in the width and breadth of what is essentially happiness, emotional. It's a very therapeutic, emotional concept about feeling good. And if the child is not feeling good, and there were things that don't make the child feel good, then we should have, again, professionals taking note of this, perhaps intervening with sharing data on this. Now that so I essentially got a group together, which ended up being formed as the Not a Named Person campaign, which again was made up of a variety of different groups, mainly the Christian Institute in terms of the organisational framework and the funding for it. And they took it, as you know, to the Supreme Court in England and won. I was actually opposed to the use of the Supreme Court because I think it's anti-democratic. I think the SNP are an elected body, and I don't like judges making decisions on our behalf, because who are they? If the judges had said, I mean, I don't care what the judges would have said, I would have said, well, I don't think it's up to the judges to make that decision. It's up to the people to make that decision. Having said that, would I say I'm not happy that it happened? I would be lying, because that it then acted as a barrier to the named person to an extent. However, as far as I can see, the whole framework, the whole ethos, the whole foundation and understanding of well-being and the need for professionals to engage and intervene around a child's well-being, I think.
The spirit's alive and well, that's for sure. I mean, young people in Scotland have a named person. And the bit that was struck down by the Supreme Court, that was about the data sharing. But there's still the principle that the threshold at which the professionals think they should intervene in a family is this well-being, which does mean more or less happiness. So whereas the threshold to intervene used to be abuse or neglect, which is pretty serious stuff, it's now basically if a child's unhappy, a social worker, a teacher, whatever, will be thinking, right, this is time when we need to do something.
Having said that, if you read the Supreme Court judgment, the two things, so the data thing was completely knocked back, but the other thing they said was well-being is ill-defined, you need to define it, it's far too broad, etc., etc. So they did say that. I mean, I don't know, the Scottish Government seemed to have completely, it hasn't been part of the discussion as far as I can see. The data thing has, because it's absolutely legal, but the well-being thing, they seem to just ignore that completely as far as I can see.
And there's something I think is actually worse than the named person scheme that's being proposed now that doesn't seem to be attracting any attention at all in the media, in politics. So the named person scheme lowered the threshold from abuse and neglect or cruelty, whatever, down to well-being. That hasn't gone too well. But what they're trying to do now is basically redefine abuse to mean well-being. So there's a consultation, well, there has been a consultation in the early stages of redefining the crime of child abuse. And their redefinition includes things like this. An adult swinging from rage to warmth to rage. Okay, that's the definition of child abuse. Ridiculing a child. The old definition was things like harming a limb, causing them to lose their sight or hearing or whatever. Really quite serious stuff. But ridicule a child. Push a child away. Make them feel they are useless or worthless. So that's child abuse. So if a child at schools will be asking about these things, children will be taught about them. So if a child says or implies that they feel useless or worthless at home, that would trigger a child abuse investigation and all that would entail. Let me read some others. The adult may seem irritated by the existence of the child. So being irritated with a child. Make the child feel that their opinions, views or feelings are worthless. So make a child feel that their feelings are worthless. And that's child abuse. These are examples of what they think should be child abuse. Expose a child to anger. I just find it's quite bizarre living in Scotland. That there's things like this that are just so outrageously ridiculous. And yet, there's like the Scottish Bonds, a parallel universe, where this will just float through all the committees. The discussions will be things like, oh, do you think we ought to make the implementation phase 2 months longer to give us a bit longer to get everything in place for it? That's the sort of discussion they'll have around it. But it's completely outrageous. Reward the child for bigotry. I mean, what on earth does that mean? How do you reward a child for bigotry? What's their definition of bigotry? Probably quite a few views that I hold they would class as bigotry. So I think this is more serious than the named person scheme. The named person scheme could result in a sort of busybody named person coming in to support and advise the family because the child wasn't happy, because of well-being concerns. Whereas what they're proposing would take it up a level, and it would be, right, these well-being concerns, well, forget well-being, this is child abuse. Forget the named person coming around and busybodying to support you and advise you. It'll be the police. I say, and how this is not a huge controversy, I don't know, but that's so often the way. When the named person was first proposed, the Conservatives abstained. They didn't vote against it in the first instance. So this, I say, is going through the Scottish Parliament without making waves at all. Anything else about the named person you want to?
Well, I'm curious to see how this develops. I mean, as you say, there does seem to be a curious, complete lack of critical thinking in the Scottish Parliament, in compared to what I think a lot of people might at least raise an eyebrow, if not feel completely against. The Conservatives in particular, not that I'm much of a Conservative myself, but you know, on these kind of matters, you would think the Conservative Party might be a little bit conservative. But that does seem to be one of the interesting things. But having said that, it's a very interesting thing that we have a party that used to be a socialist party that's no longer socialist. A party that at least was called Liberal that isn't Liberal. So it entirely makes sense that we have a Conservative party that isn't conservative. And this has been the trend. And I mean, I'm reading stuff at the minute. I'm looking at the collapse of moral arguments, and you know, this has been going on for quite a long time now. That Conservatives have lost a sense of moral weight with their arguments, and have started to use alternative arguments.
But in Scotland, as I said out there, the Greens lead the way, Labour, Lib Dem, and the SNPs will follow on behind, and then the Conservatives are running along, trotting along at the back, trying to keep up, trying to not be too far away from where they are. Which brings us on to mention the smacking ban quickly. That's the other thing in this area. That's in the news. The Conservatives are not opposing it as a party. I think even though most of their MSPs are saying they're opposing it as a party, they're not opposing it. Now the smacking ban, I think from what you said, we can see the sort of principles apply there. But I was reading something that Stuart wrote earlier on today about restorative justice within the criminal justice system. And I've written and spoken quite a bit about restorative approaches within education. I think for the Scottish Government, it's not just that they don't like the idea of smacking, even though that is part of it. It's a broader philosophy that they just don't like the idea of punishments full stop. They think punishments unnecessary because they think humans are basically good. If you just treat them right and are nice enough to them, they'll be nice in return, and there won't be any need for any sort of punishment at all. So in schools, I mean, lots of teachers, I've spoken to lots of teachers about this who say it's just totally disastrous, and there's mayhem in schools, kids just getting used to getting away with all sorts. Because they know there's never a punishment, there's always a little counselling session. That's the best way to deal with it all. So I think what the SNP, well, the Greens have led it, but what the Scottish Parliament collectively are going to do in banning smacking, that's partly they're implementing that philosophy. The next step, I would think, they'll be looking at other forms of punishment within the family as well, because they disapprove of all of them. So within schools, they're trying to do away with punishment completely, and they're pushing in that direction pretty hard. And so somewhere down the line, those same views will come through to the family as well. If you look about corporal punishment, when was that banned in schools? Like mid-80s? And it's now been banned in the home. But I think the process will accelerate, and it won't be long before they'll be saying that other punishments shouldn't be used within the home as well. They're already saying shouting at them is not on. What's your take on that? The restorative justice and the criminal justice system? Did you see any parallel there, or do you think it's a separate sort of thing?
No, I do. I mean, this is a big problem. I mean, I always see things as big problems and assume nothing can change these things to a certain extent, despite being persistently prepared to bang my head against a wall. I do just presume that there is a wall there, but Who knows? The world is interesting and things do appear to be changing to a certain extent. But you can look back, I mean, some of the stuff I've lectured on tries to look at the issue of authority, and you can look back to writings of Hannah Arendt and Margaret Mead in the early 60s, where they describe, what they say is this is the first time that they can say in human history that the generation that is older than the younger generation doesn't have some level of spontaneous authority. So historically, and Margaret Mead is an anthropologist, and she describes different types of societies. And she says, you know, when you have more fluid societies, there's always been a certain amount of tension, but nevertheless, there's been a presumption that the older people at the parental level should have a certain amount of spontaneous authority. Whereas from this period onwards, there was already in society a questioning of the legitimacy of authority, which I put down to a much broader problem of modern society and modern society not being confident about what are human values, which for me are enlightenment values. That's what I would say I'm interested in, are enlightenment values, rational humanist values. And by the mid-20th century, society, because I think all of its contradictions, tensions, inequalities and so on, had lost a lot of confidence in what are its core values. And the reason that is important in terms of authority is because if you don't have a strong sense of what your values are, it's impossible to have authority.
Yeah.
It's impossible to then, so the discipline, the smacking, the punishment, all that can only make sense because, you know, smacking, you know, whether you smack, don't smack, who cares? The state shouldn't have anything to do with it, but who cares? You should work out your own form of authority. But that authority would be predicated and based, at least in part, on a strong sense that society has, that we have got strong values, which then, in a kind of one way or another, works its way through adults, and adults have a strong sense of authority themselves in relation to children.
I would say that there's certain values missing, but I think the value that's there, that's overemphasized and is too central in lots of ways, is equality. So they look at children and adults, think there's an inequality here, they're treated differently, they're not treated the same. That must be a bad thing. What can we do to sort it out? And that's what the whole children's rights movement is about. I went to something in the Fringe last summer called Abolish Childhood, an academic from Edinburgh University. And he was arguing that we should completely abolish the idea of childhood, so children should be free to leave home when whenever they're old enough to want to do it. They should be able to get a job whenever they like. They should be able to vote in elections as soon as they can understand that you have to register to vote and go along and vote. So the Minister of English Childhood. And you see it in schools as well. They're trying to democratise everything. So instead of the teachers having authority, telling the kids what to do, it's all going to be agreed together. It's all like a democracy. You talk it through and reach an agreement. Which comes to the restorative practice business as well. It's not that one person punishes another, it's just that you sort of make friends again. I mean, the peak stupidity of that was a report in the newspaper where a teacher in Fife was stabbed in the neck by a boy with a pencil in a secondary school in Fife. And a union representative said, what should happen in these situations where there's been a violent attack on a teacher is a dialogue should be entered into between the pupil and the teacher so they can restore the relationship, so they can make friends again. So the whole idea of authority between adults and children, they're against the whole thing. They want equality. And that's where the children's rights obsession comes in as well. In schools, they go on about rights so much. Every corridor, virtually, will have posters about rights, assemblies about rights, special lessons about them. The actual content of the United Nations Convention on Rights of the Child isn't actually applicable to much that goes on in school, but they just take it to mean this sort of very liberal, everything's got to be negotiated, no one tells kids what to do. And the kids take that on board, and they get a sort of, no one's got the right to tell me what to do sort of attitude. And also, no one's got the right to punish me sort of attitude as well. But if you look at the actual rights, the one about punishment, it says things like you're not allowed, this is for under 18s, you're not allowed to have the death penalty or torture or life imprisonment without chance of parole or whatever. That's what the right actually says. But in schools it gets translated into everyone has to be really softly, and a half-hour detention's a bit much. You should just have a chat about it. So I think it's an unbalanced value system where equality is elevated.
Well, it's interesting because again, I teach a little bit about restorative justice in terms of criminal justice system. I have guest speakers in who promote restorative justice, and then I attack them and encourage the students to sort of have a critical look at this. One of the things I think is interesting is because I think an alternative way to describe what you're saying, which I wouldn't disagree with what you said, but I think an alternative way of describing it is that it's like a new form of authoritarianism, where what's happening is that professionals, teachers and so on, are colonizing your inner self, i.e. your emotional self. Right? So you have a more therapeutic relationship, but that doesn't mean that the child can do whatever they want, because really, we know there are still rules. We know the children aren't really making the rules, right? The rules are really made by therapeutic practitioners, but they're not value-based, so they're very flexible. You can say everything you like, but as long as you're forgiving. So, for example, restorative justice, the way restorative justice works, is that the victim has to say that they're going to forgive, and the perpetrator has to want to apologise. Right? And they spend time, the professionals go and see the victim, say, would you like to do this process? And it's voluntary, so you don't have to do it. It's voluntary, so they go and ask you, would you like to do this? Would you like to do this? Of course, there's voluntary and there's voluntary. Because if a professional person comes to you and says, would you like to do this? You automatically feel that, you feel there's a certain obligation. You might not do it, but nevertheless. And if you're the perpetrator and they say to you, would you like to apologise? There's voluntary, and it's not very voluntary when you're in that situation. So you then get these coming together of these two parties with a framework already established, where you've almost been educated about how to be emotionally correct, and then you carry on this process of being emotionally correct. And I think there's probably, I'm not a school teacher, but there's probably a similar process taking place in schools. And again, I think it's a reflection of a loss of clear values. So whatever type of teacher you were historically, as long as you had a sense of values of what you believed in as an individual and what you thought education was for, that could be the basis of you disciplining a child, which is also about leading a child, inspiring a child, getting them over their adolescent anxieties and so on. Whereas what happened again, so a great book called Vanishing Adolescence, written in 1960, another American book, where he describes at that point already schools in America are avoiding these big questions, avoiding leadership, avoiding strong values and disciplines, and incorporating external therapeutic agents or themselves becoming therapeutic. And it becomes, so it is a loss of a strong sense of discipline, but it's also a new type of managing of individuals through this sort of therapeutic framework.
In the Getting It Right for Every Child scheme, I call it Scenarification. Scenario are these sort of well-being indicators, which could sort of make sense. If you're a social worker and you're trying to assess how a kid's doing, are they safe, are they healthy or whatever, okay, fair enough. But they teach the kids about them, and then routinely, like every few weeks, the kids are sat down and they have to fill a questionnaire in to give themselves a mental health checkup. Are they feeling nurtured? Are they active? Are they feeling included in their groups of friends? But in going through that process, it effectively implies to the kids, we're expecting that you're constantly going to be having, I feel they might even call that sort of mild mental health problems. You're going to have real struggles and worries and concerns that you need us to support you with. And that's the routine. And if a kid fills it in and just goes, oh yeah, fine. The response is likely to be, here's someone who's not quite mature enough. Here's someone who's not at the stage where they're willing to be open with us about what's really going on. So they're not doing as well with this process. And the kids will just start to pick up that the teacher's not really very happy with them when they haven't got anything negative to say, so they'll try harder next time. I was reading something the other day where the primary school had a worry box where the kids are told, write what you're concerned about, put it in this little box, and then they'd read them out the next day. And a kid went home to his parents and said, I couldn't think of anything to put in the worry box. And the teacher said, can you come up with something for tomorrow? And I can't think of anything. I don't know what to do. What shall I do? But it's this messy, this normalization that life's a real, that the ordinary things is a real struggle. And you need the teachers to, well, not arm around you, obviously, but a metaphorical arm around you to try and support you through it. That's a circle time idea. But another big thing is when kids go from primary school to secondary school, it's as though they're preparing to climb Mount Everest, that this is so traumatic and stressful. You have to start the preparations for it months in advance and write down all the things you're worried about, and they do various things to try and help you through this process. Whereas the other end of the spectrum will be hearing stories about people who really did heroic things, battling against the odds, life and death situations. But that's not really on the agenda. It's making quite ordinary things seem really traumatic and implying, like you're saying, that you need professional support to go ahead with it. And that's virtually universal.
Yeah. Well, that's the, again, Frank Frady wrote a book called Therapy Culture in, I think it was 2002. And it was, if you're essentially a prediction of what will happen is the more that we have a therapeutic relationship with children, the more that schools adopt therapeutic language and so on, then what will happen is that children incorporate this and start to understand their everyday difficulties through psychological language. So you start to get the rise that children are depressed, children are this, children are that, and so on and so forth. And it's almost like a professional construction of mental health problems, which children have now been given by professionals. A language that they didn't have 20 years ago, they now have this language because professionals have given this language, because professionals themselves increasingly understand, we all, to a certain extent, increasingly understand life and difficulties through this sort of therapeutic discourse.
Yep.
The language of addiction, the language of self-esteem, and so on, has become a framework through which we understand social problems. Certainly politicians, social policy is developed around this framework. And then we get these children that we have created.
I would say even with, if you say a sportsman visiting a school, whereas you might have expected years ago, they'd say, I trained really hard, I broke my leg at this point, and this time was tough, whatever, but then I got through the team and it was really good. Whereas now you're probably equally likely to get the sort of, I was bullied at school, I was depressed at this stage, and that would just be the normal sort of thing. And people would be encouraged to, if you like, to sort of glorify that more than the achievements. So some schools have as well on the playground, primary schools, there's a lonely bench. So if there's if you haven't got any friends, if no one's playing with you, you're going to sit on the lonely bench, and then I don't know, the teacher can get someone else to come and play with you. Then you can see maybe that might have a place. But if that sort of culture is there too much, do kids really need to learn to have a bit of advice and learn how to go and join in what's going on and play with everyone else? Or do they need to get in the habit that if you're not quite in the gang, then you get someone to help you and take you in? At the moment, it's really unbalanced. This is a balance issue. Kids need support in various ways. They have their difficulties they have to face. But the balance, I think, is very skewed in a sort of therapeutic direction. So if we just hold questions for a while.
Well, it is because.
Well, if we just wait until we've
okay.
Till we just went just about 10 minutes.
It was funny that my partner's daughter was in a dance group, and they won the dance competition for the first time. There's always there's like a super dance group. It's like one of these American films where you've got the super dance group and they're like the less super dance group. Super dance group always win, but this time they won. And I watched the dance, right? So I thought, I'll watch the dance. Someone's put it on wherever it was, so I watched the dance. Brilliantly done. And of course the dance it was like this girl, starts off, this girl start dancing around, and this girl sort of like, you think, oh, she's having a hard time. And then the other girls are kind of running at her, you can see it, right? So she's being picked on etc. It's brilliantly done, and at the end, it's like you just see a shadow, and she's hung herself, right? And the whole story was about bullying at school, and she hangs herself. The irony is, you talk to this girl, Megan, who's not a very sympathetic child anyway, in terms of like, but she always just says, this bullying thing, what are they on about? Nobody gets bullied at school. Right? So that's her perception of school life. Nobody gets bullied at school, and yet when they come, because it had to be a social issue dance, they come to do a social issue dance. That's what they did. Even though I suspect all the other girls think, what are they on about? Nobody gets bullied at school. They've been educated by the adults that that's a social issue, and then they produce a story which fits with the issue that they've been taught. I mean, absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, some people talk about it as anti-bullyism. It's a sort of philosophy. Because kids, there's a huge emphasis on bullying in school. I mean, bullying in school can be a real issue and it can need dealing with. That's fine. But the approach to it, okay, it's a matter of balance. You don't really get the sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never heal you. Just ignore it, take no notice. You don't really get that message so much. It would be more towards the bullying's really terrible. Like I say, here's a story about someone who committed suicide because they were bullied. That's how bad it is to be bullied. So if you're bullied, you know, you need to get help with it, and it's really serious. So it's creating the mindset of the people that they're really vulnerable to having terrible damage done to them by people saying nasty things to them, rather than just sort of shrug it off, try and, you know, argue back or whatever. So I think it leads to this, it like implants the idea of vulnerability into their minds.
Yes, which is one that it's probably his best, I think. He's got a more sociological concept, a guy called Frank Frady, which is called Diminished Subjectivity, which is both about a sense of diminished individual capacity, but also at a societal level, a diminished sense of our capacity as humans. So there's a greater sense that what we do is damaging. We'll destroy the earth, we're destructive, we're abusive, relationships problematic, and so on. And at the level of a diminished subjectivity at the individual level, it's related to this idea of vulnerability, that essentially what we all are, essentially all of us are vulnerable. And I think, I mean, that's what the new book I'm trying to write on the criminalisation of everything. The core theme I'm interested in is this issue of vulnerability and the extent to which institutions, organisations, policies, law presume vulnerability. So hate crime, which is the article I wrote this last week on hate crime. The presumption is that you have this thing called vulnerable groups. Right? So a rather patronising category. So you're a woman, you are a part of a vulnerable group. You're a black woman, you're doubly part of two vulnerable, and so on. And so categories historically that are understood in terms of oppression and politically are recategorised through, again, more psychological concepts and categorised as being vulnerable. And once they're vulnerable, you need to be protected, and you need to be protected from other people, which then you start to have a sort of acceleration of a form of criminalisation in various parts of life. Children, of course, it's even more problematic because children universally are vulnerable. That's their category. And therefore, what's interesting about this in terms of lots of ways, once you understand people as vulnerable, freedom becomes a problem. Because if we are all free and everyone is vulnerable, then the potential of abuse between people, the danger that other people represent to you, is problematic. So the more that this idea of vulnerability develops, the more we categorise people as vulnerable groups, the more we necessarily need to support people, and to a certain extent, the more we accept that support and actually think that we need it. Certainly in terms of children, it's absolutely the case.
Something that really brought it out for me was the controversy over the primary one tests in Scotland. It was a few months ago now. But the SNP, perfectly sensibly I thought, they wanted to have standard tests for every kid in the country at primary one stage, and there are another couple of stages as well. So in primary one, the kid would sit at a computer and they could try it out, have a few practice runs. It was things like, click on the dog, and you click on the dog, that sort of thing. Or how many apples are there? Is it 1 or 2? And you click on the answer. That's really straightforward. And then when you do the test, the software works. So if you get a question wrong, then if you get a couple wrong, it just keeps you giving you easy questions. If you keep getting them right, the questions get a bit harder. So no one sits there stuck for half an hour. It tunes it to your level while you're doing it. So that seems pretty innocuous and pretty sensible thing to do there. But the reactions from the teaching unions, from some teachers, from parents, it was amazing. One teacher said, it's as though we're robbing these children of their childhood. We're traumatizing them. It's cruel, the way they're teaching them. One teacher said, children should never be expected to have to try and answer a question that they don't know the answer to. And things like that. I mean, total loss of perspective. How can anyone possibly think that? But if you think sitting kids down for half an hour to a computer to just do some easy questions like that is sort of tantamount to child abuse, I mean, what can you expect from children? However do they conduct the rest of their lessons? It's a total loss of perspective again, from the vulnerability point of view. Right, I think we can have some questions. Always the best bit. Just to say before questions, if we could stick to questions, we haven't actually got a way of recording the questions, but if you talk loud enough, I think that phone might get it. Otherwise, we'll dub it over on the recording and repeat what you said. But Jude.
Well, you can call me paranoid if you like, but when I heard about how more money was going to be put into mental health for school children, I worry that we're going to go down the same road as America, where even young babies are medicated. You know, do you think there's a likelihood of that?
So with ADHD, that sort of thing?
Well, no. In America,
Depression.
basically, they do tend to over-medicate.
Right. Stuart?
do you want to have a few questions for me? I'll come back to that.
Right, okay, yeah.
Just
With a question or two?
Need to think.
I'd like to do something.
Very good, yeah.
Me?
Yes, I have.
It's half an observation, half a question. I know where you're coming from, but I'm concerned that perhaps you're going too far the opposite way. Two issues that disturbed me was the fact that I didn't feel you were taking mental abuse and emotional abuse seriously as a family issue, making a child feel worthless, ridiculing and not paying attention to their opinions. But I do agree with you that I don't think it's an issue for outside intervention. Also, you were mentioning bullying. Most children don't think bullying exists in schools. That is absolutely not true. Most children know that bullying does exist, and my own son disappeared from home for 6 hours when he was 13, so they had to call in the police. And they met him at the bottom of the hill, brought him home, and he'd walked all the way from Fairmont Head to Port Seton in despair because he was getting bullied. So where do you see the importance of making this an issue? I saw a lovely advertisement, which I haven't seen for a long time, from Children First. And the first scenario was a mum with her toddler having a tantrum, showing them that she sat him down, she comforted him, she spoke to him, and that was fine, and the little boy subsided. The second scenario was a teenager coming rampaging in, I don't want to talk to you, going upstairs, flinging her clothes around, slamming the door, and a few minutes later the mum came in, sat in her bed and sat down, and they just sat in silence, and the young girl burst into tears. The point of the video was your children will always need you, and I know this is more of an observation than a question, I do apologise, but I feel that that sort of advertising would be far more relevant and far more effective if more of it was put out to enable parents. And do you see this as a good middle road?
Okay, right, thank you.
I would also be interested to know what other people think about the bullying question in relation to that, because I know what you mean. Because I know what you mean. I don't agree with you, but I know what you mean.
Well, you didn't have a son who disappeared for 6 hours and I just sat staring at the
Your
floor.
one
wondering if I was
example
ever
is that
going to
it
see
doesn't
him again.
explain the entire concept. But anyway.
Sorry to get emotional.
I would agree with quite a lot of what you've said, but I must say I too was concerned about what you said about bullying, because I know that for my 3 children in different environments, they had considerable amount of problem with bullying. And one of the things that concerns me was that so many schools actually have what are called anti-bullying policies, which are not really worth the paper they're written on.
So chip in that first with bullying. I think certainly bullying's a problem, but the question is how is it best responded to? But I think at the moment, one side that might be lacking is where you have got someone who has been vindictive and been extremely unpleasant for another kid, where I might think it might be best for the school to come down on them like a ton of bricks, really teach them a lesson, and they'll think, wow, I'm just not going to do that again because it wasn't worth it. Look what happened to me. So I think that side's lacking in a lot of cases. I think on the other side as well, I think the schools in many cases don't encourage resilience either. So I think there's the 2 parts which are lacking. But kids can certainly be pretty unpleasant to each other, that's for sure. And it is necessary for adults to intervene in that from occasions. But I think that the missing parts at the moment are likely to be the encouraging resilience and the really being stern and strict with perpetrators where that's necessary. I think the sort of emotional support side, there's going to be, we would hope there'll be plenty of that in terms of explaining the consequences and how upsetting it is to other people, for the perpetrator as well. I would imagine that would be there in most cases, but I think there's some of the other aspects that might be neglected. Stuart, do you want to chip in on that?
Well, people want to speak, so I'll let them chip in, see what they say.
Yeah, I think from what I've heard said here tonight, you're attacking the heads of the Hydra and not the heart. I'm just looking at one bit of your leaflet here. It says, schools are not for social engineering and indoctrination into the philosophy favoured by the government. I'm sorry, that's exactly what state schools are for. And until you get to the heart of this, it's state schools that are the problem. And as long as you demand that the state educates your child, and as long as you demand that a child has a right to an education, which it has no such right, has a right to learn, but it doesn't have the right to force somebody to educate it, I think you're going to be, you're fighting against thunder, unless you actually recognise that it's state schools that are the problem. And we're in danger in Scotland of sleeping on the job, because the SNP and the Scottish Government are heavily enamoured with countries like Sweden, who have already criminalised homeschooling.
Yep.
Germany has criminalised homeschooling, and if we're not careful, we're going to miss the boat here, because state interference is even coming into private schools. But it's state schools that are the problem.
Yeah, in terms of homeschooling,
Yeah.
Scottish Family Party policy is to support homeschooling parents by making resources available, etc. But I think you're absolutely right. I'm surprised it hasn't come onto the agenda already in Scotland, because they're so convinced that their one way is the only way of bringing up kids properly, and their one message is the only message that kids should be hearing, that they don't like the idea of parents bringing up kids according to their own values, as they've got a human right to do. I actually reported the Scottish Government to the Equality and Human Rights Commission weeks ago, saying that the Thai campaign thing is violating parents' rights to have children educated according to their own beliefs and values. I mean, obviously, it's always the same. I mean, I didn't do it with any expectation that the Equality and Human Rights Commission was going to come back and say, yes, you're right. Parents do have a right to have children educated according to their values. We'll start a legal case against the Scottish Government. But of course they're not. They're just a campaigning group funded by the government. It was never going to happen. So yeah, homeschool is one thing. I think independent schools, you're right, that the state's tightening its grip on independent schools. They've got a lot of experience with that. They won't necessarily give them a document and say, this is what you have to do, but they'll come and inspect and say, we think it would be a good idea if you did it this way. And when we come back again, we'd like to hear about how you got on with our new idea. And if you go back and say, well, we tried your new idea, I'm afraid it didn't work very well, it was a bit rubbish, then who gets criticised for that? I mean, Education Scotland don't say, oh, maybe your idea is rubbish, so you're not doing it properly. So they impose their philosophy on independent schools pretty firmly. I think state education is a necessary and good thing, but it's a political issue as to how it's controlled and the nature of it. So that's the sort of battle we're in, to exert political influence over the state
Maybe
education
try and
system.
start smaller and maybe convince the mafia to become a charitable organisation rather than do it the hard way and try and tackle schools and force them. Because I don't think that's going to happen. Get your kids out of school, out of state education is the only way to stop this.
And lots of people are doing that now, and I
Yeah.
can understand why people want to do that. With the Scottish Family Party, we want to, like you say, get to the heart of the hydra, because it's government policy is the issue. It comes from the top, and that's the only place where it can really be changed. So, lady behind you.
I'd be really interested in your comments on the gender imbalance within the teaching profession when it comes to the socialising of children.
Yeah.
Boys require such different socialising, so disciplining a boy child by father or a girl child by his father is a completely different thing than from by the mother, for example. But we have this, again, the appropriation of so much of family business into the classroom, and this huge imbalance within the classrooms. And I feel it's a big problem.
Yeah. You go first on that one. Primary school staff, 90% female. And I think overall that Scottish teachers, 77% female. And I think it will continue to go in that direction because the nature of the job, if you like, is heading in that direction as well. So if you like to generalise about the average mother, the average father, the average mother might be a bit more nurturing and empathic and talk you through, whereas dad might be a bit more put his foot down, a bit of a challenge and whatever. In general, that's what it would be. I mean, the direction of Scottish education is very definitely all towards the more typical sort of motherly sort of style. So then what's happening is a lot of female teachers feel they're in their element, they love it. Whereas male teachers in that environment more often are thinking, they feel like a fish out of water. I mean, how many male teachers want to sit doing circle time with a bunch of 15-year-olds asking about what they're worried about this week and how the relationships are, or whatever?
Excuse me, it's not about what the teachers are doing, it's the effect that they're having on the children. You know, how many 8-year-old boys want to be asked how they feel when all they want to do is the Guinness Book of Records.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the other side of it. It makes school more alien for boys as well. So boys feel like a fish out of water.
What can
That's right.
you do about that?
I think that the way to deal with it is, I think if the policy from the top changed and this sort of therapeutic direction was reversed. And so you let the games coach be what he wants to be. He wants to be a coach. He wants to get his team out there and go and, I don't know, let's go and smash them, boys. Let's go and see what we're doing. That would, people would be horrified to hear that now. So the sports coach now, who might be doing a fantastic job with that group of boys who might be otherwise pretty wayward and wild, but he's got them moulded into a team and they're loving it and they're learning all sorts of skills and disciplines. But he's never going to be invited to the education conference or given a pat on the back by the inspectors, because they're just not interested. I mean, if he had started, a little support group for a few kids who are struggling, which might be perfectly valid, then he would get a pat on the back. So I think for the boys and for the staff, it's tending to move in a sort of feminizing direction. And it results in the boys being seen as like defective girls. That really to be a better student, can you not just say a bit more in circle time? Can you not talk about your feelings as well as the girls do? They're really good at that. And boys pick up on that. And alongside that, you've got all the sort of feminist inspired special programs for girls. Girls can do anything, girls are great. You've got all that alongside it. So I would be quite keen to see a bit of rebellion from some boys in Scottish schools to say really they've had enough of it. But there's no sign of it yet on any scale.
You're going straight.
Well,
I mean, again, for me, the interesting, there's loads of aspects to this, but the idea of vulnerability again comes into it. See, the bullying thing, I think the problem with today is that, and I agree with you, my story's a bit one-sided in terms of what Megan is like as a child, but I know a few of her friends and they're a bit like her as well. But I do think it's much more the case that children have been educated that bullying is everywhere in schools. I think they get taught that. as you say, transitions and the difficulty of transitions. You get taught this. I had this when my child was moving from primary to high school. There was a meeting with the head teacher turned up, the guidance teacher, and the deputy head. The deputy head did a talk about how we're going to look after your child in the first 2 weeks and how you'll have support workers and a support child and a support that. Then the guidance teacher spoke. It was like an hour later, I put my hand up and I says, is there anything about education you'd like to tell me about? And that's a problem. But then the next question, so I then, that was my question. But then the next question was from a woman next to me, a bit of a fragile child, must be said. But she said this was the ferry. If any of you know the ferry in Dundee, the ferry in Dundee is like a nice middle class area of Dundee. And they said, oh, she put her hand up and said, could you just tell me, what do you do to stop the children going to the ferry at lunchtime? And it was like, what, is this the Bronx? And then the teachers had to respond to that. And that was, to me, that was an interesting illustration of that parents are very anxious about their children. I think parents are much more concerned about things like bullying, not just in extreme situations where children are targeted individually and systematically bullied, but what bullying is described as today is almost anything. So not having someone in your friend group and so on becomes what bullying is. The head teacher, he's deputy head now, he's just a teacher again in a private school outside Glasgow, and he said the head there had to get all the girls in from second and third year and say to them, stop coming to us about bullying. Right? Just because someone calls you a name or isn't nice to you for a day doesn't mean you've been bullied. Right? He had a whole assembly about that. But that's very unusual. I suspect if you did that in the state sector, I suspect he would not get that job, and so on. And so the people who get promoted in jobs are people who accept this framework that children are profoundly vulnerable, that almost anything can be categorised as bullying, and children need to be protected. So you can't, the idea that children can be resilient is wrong. And the idea that, again, that a teacher can be tough and in your face, and that could be a woman or a man. I had tough female teachers. I mean, I don't accept, I mean, I know what you mean in terms of the general guy, the general woman, and I know what you mean. But I had women teachers at my school who were utterly terrifying. Utterly, the little English teacher, she was about 4'3", skinny, absolutely terrifying. You know, like my little fat friend was crying in second year English when he was forced to read his book, Mrs. Roscoe she was called. Absolutely terrifying woman. And so it's not just, in other words, it's just any teacher who is prepared to be authoritative and tough. So I, for example, in my seminar groups with my students, I insist, this is just because this was in my political education when I grew up involved in politics, it was always quite tough. And they'd expect you read a book and you'll ask and you go around the group and every person has to speak. So I did this in my group. I expect everyone to speak. So I go round. Right? Every single year in the module reports that they anonymously can hand in, Dr. Waiton is intimidating. He's made my life hell. It's terrible. And the thing is, if I say to them, what did you think of the reading? And they just say, oh, nothing. I say, okay, I'll just move on. I mean, I don't I don't do anything. I don't say anything. I just have to ask them. These are adults, right? These are 19, 20-year-olds, people going into the world, right? And every single year I have this thing. So I agree. I think that the framework, and there is you could say there's a masculine element, a feminine element, but it doesn't have to be. I don't care whether the teacher's a woman or a man to a certain extent. I accept your point. I want teachers who can be themselves and who can be authoritative. And if part of that means being tough, being assertive, being even aggressive, as that's part of your teaching method, and then I think that's fine. There should be scope for teachers to be themselves and to be able to push students as much as they can. And I don't think that is not the framework that we have.
I've got a question for Dr. Waiton about, earlier on you were talking about restorative justice, And what I picked up on your experience of it came through as quite negative. Have you got, I mean, I've done some work in shots, and I was interested to know, do you have any positive experience of restorative justice, like in terms of offenders being confronted with victim impacts? I mean, and just as you were talking there about, you know, authoritative teaching, I think my perspective is that there is a place for that, for offenders to be confronted by their victims and to have a better understanding of the impact that they've had. Not so there has to be some airy-fairy kind of let's how can we be friends type thing.
Yeah. No, I would say you can. My critique of restorative justice is kind of more, is a bit more abstract and theoretical in terms of trying to understand where it's come from and how it's developed and what are some of the underlying broad problems with it. That doesn't mean that within that situation you can't have individuals who get something out of it. I think in almost any situation, in therapeutic situations, there's almost any situation, I think you can have decent things come out of it. That doesn't mean that the thing itself is necessarily something I would support. I think the interesting thing about restorative justice in Scotland, in England, and in most places in fact, is that it's mainly used for kids. Right? And that makes sense to me. And the reason that it's mainly used for kids is because they're kids. Right? If that makes sense. It's like, it's because you get a kid in and you're not treating them like an adult. You treat them like a child who's you're trying to teach them. Whereas to do that with an adult, because the push is to try and have restorative justice for adults as well, essentially you are infantilizing the criminal justice system, and you are presuming that the adult is not really fully responsible for their actions. That's one of the underlying frameworks. And one of the guys who I really like, a guy called Malky, who comes in and does the talk, we always end up arguing. But you can always push him to the point where he's trying not to say it, but he is really saying, it's not their fault. You know, he always comes up with examples where it's not their fault. There's something about their past, it's that, it's something to do with this, something to do with that. Yeah. They ultimately deny the individual subjectivity, they deny individual capacity, and I think that is actually dehumanizing. It might sound sympathetic, but you degrade people if you do not allow them to be responsible for their actions. You infantilize them. And I think that's why restorative justice with 15, 16, 17-year-olds, to me there's a logic to, I can understand that. But if you're doing that with a 30-year-old who's done the same thing, then I think you've really got to start to pick it apart and say what's happening.
Yeah. The way it's presented in schools is that you're to assume that there's some factor in the background that led to the bad behaviour. You just assume that's a given. And it's your job to find out what it was. What happened this morning that made them behave like this? What is it that's going on in their life? In terms of restorative practice in school, though, I think the big issue isn't so much what it brings in. The big issue is what it takes out. It's the taking out of the punishment and the taking out of your ability to say, right, if you do that once more, this is what's going to happen. It's taking that away that's the problem. It's not that all the talking about things does any harm. That's probably quite helpful. But the taking away of punishment and the threat of punishment, I think, is the bigger issue. Yes, sir.
It seems to me there's a bit of a confusion about the restorative justice. In a big part of it is to try to restore the victim as far as that is possible. So if somebody steals something from you, the very first beginning would be to return to you what has been stolen for you. And if that's gone, to bring together the funds or the money or whatever else to restore the victim and help them regain whatever they've lost, which is not always, of course, possible if somebody gets injured or killed or whatever else. But that's a lesson and a punishment to begin with. More serious punishment may be, of course, necessary. But that's, I think, a really big part of what restorative justice is supposed to be about. With, say, kids, for example, they damage something, they spray paint or whatever else. The first part of that would be, of course, to undo the damage that they've done, which I think makes quite meaningful restorative justice for children or adults as well. And to find a way to make sense.
I'm saying in schools, the sort of the putting right the damage you've done bit, that only seems to get applied in terms of relationships. which in schools that's often relevant because there are people where there is an existing relationship and there is some restoring to do. So I say so, I think that side, the thing added, which used to happen in any case, isn't the problem, it's the taking away the punishment is the issue. With criminal justice, I suppose in a lot of cases, there's no pre-existing relationship to restore. So if someone burgles your house or whatever, there isn't something to restore. Some people still might want to go down that road. That's not something I've thought about particularly.
Also people I think are forced into that nowadays. I think it's disgusting some of the times when you see these things promoted in television where you have someone getting involved in a relationship almost with someone who murdered their child, and they're being patted in the back as if this is a good thing. You know, this is really healing for them, and I don't think it is. I think it's actually it's disgraceful. Actually,
But it might be a good thing for them.
I see that. I understand that, but I'm not coming from a personal point of view. I think everybody has spoken from a personal point of view. I just mean it's an observation. To me, it disgusts me. That's how I feel when I see it. You know.
You could take it, but that sort of thing. The approach could be taken that if people want to take that personal step as well.
I don't think they do. I think people are being forced into these
outside
things.
of any formal system.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. I wasn't expecting a restorative justice discussion, but see, what again, at an individual level, you might be right. But if you look at the framework for restorative justice, again, one of the problems that I have is that there's a therapeutic presumption. So they presume that someone that has experienced crime is traumatized and needs healing. Right? So we've just heard the term healing. Right? Well, that's a presumption. Right? That is a presumption that is presumed is in general. Right? So the police now have to say, would you like victim support? So someone like steals my laces, and they would say, do you want victim support? Right? There is a presumption that we are vulnerable, not just as individuals, but communities. There's also an inflation of the importance of crime. So they reconstruct, it's almost like the way New Labour tried to understand communities, is that communities are undermined by crime. Well, really, I thought it might be to do with unemployment, right? The loss of wider values in society, the loss of other things. There's many, many other things that make up a community and an individual. But today, increasingly, we think, and the professional class, these organisations, presume that crime, damage, abuse, all these things are what have harmed the individual, who are traumatised and need healing, and we need some sort of therapeutic intervention. And that is a complete caricature, and it leads to this rather artificial state form of intervention, which I do think ends up being almost like a form of colonising of your emotional self. So you as the victim are meant to be accepting this apology. You as a victim are meant to be engaging in this process, having been trained about what is the correct form of practice, and that is meant to then resolve the problem. It's a bit like the way there's a presumption that in South Africa or Northern Ireland and these other places, if people can apologise, we have this healing, the whole political economic framework of what this society is, we can push that aside and we can just replace it with some sort of therapeutic practice. Hey presto, everything's all right. And again, I think while in individual cases you might well have some positive outcomes and so on, I think there's all these wider things that we need to look at, as well as the fact that actually if you want me to apologise to you, I could get on my knees and start crying now and apologise to you for something that I don't give a crap about apologising for. So what is the reality of an apology? And that I think is a really problematic aspect. I'm going to have to go in about 3 minutes, by the way, but anyway. Sorry.
One more question?
So maybe just to shut it back again.
Okay.
I was really not talking about the apology, I was talking about undoing the actual damage.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. I understand.
So,
just to ask, so there seems to be a contradiction between seeing groups of people as being individually vulnerable, but I would think that there is an exception, not just in a legal sense, but in a societal sense as well, that children are deserving of special protection. And in instances where some parents are just driven to physically harm the children because of the kind of the power and control and the privacy that families have, that there has to be some mechanism for state intervention in that. And so would you agree? And would you accept that some parents, just like they're driven to harm the children physically, are driven to harm the children emotionally and psychologically? And should there be a kind of parallel state intervention in that? And then the subsequent problem is, where do you draw the line? And just like there should be laws against physically harming your children, and that keeps getting pushed back until you can't smack anymore, then if you accept the notion that there's such a thing as emotional abuse and that the state has a role in intervening because of the power that parents have over the children, where do you draw the line to stop that getting pushed back, where it becomes impossible to discipline them? So I accept the problem of where that ends up, and the kind of the deprivation of adult power and authority and leadership, but then you have to confront that dark side, and you have to
Someone asked a question earlier on about that as well, which we didn't get to. I think the current law does mention, I can't remember the wording exactly, but it says something about, it's quite old-fashioned. I think it might say something like causing mental derangement. I think that might be the term. So it already covers what you might call psychological damage. It covers it in terminology that you would see as meaning something pretty severe, whereas the trend now is to be something that's very vague and could claim any time. So yeah, again, there's a balance. I think the existing law seems to function well, and genuine abuse and neglect isn't going unpunished at the moment. I think the existing law covers what needs to be covered. But what's happening now is the law for abuse and neglect is being used to enforce a style of parenting.
So what is the Scottish Family Party's policy on where that line should be drawn, and what is acceptable state apparatus for that intervention?
I think the existing wording of the law, the wording is old-fashioned, but the sentiment of it, I think, is right the way it is. It's interesting in Britain now, saying that you think the law should stay the way it is quite often gets you labelled as a real radical extremist. But I think it's one of those situations. I think the existing law is adequate. Did you go and get your train? Are you going to be here till?
Yes.
That's fine. Right, thank you very much. Can we give Stuart a round of applause? Right, thank you. We'll just have one more question and then I'll just tie things up.
So, some of these policies have probably been executed in other countries elsewhere in the world. How far down the line are those other countries, and is a way of challenging it, both looking at where they are now, and also is there a way of challenging it by comparing what other parts of the UK are doing?
That's interesting. I think Scotland's at the forefront of all these things. I mean, Wales was normally not be far behind. I mean, England is still heading in the same direction, but Scotland's at the forefront. The countries where this is worse, if you like, would be Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway in particular. And stories come through, obviously, someone needs to bother translating it, someone needs to bother reporting it, but you get some real horror stories from over there of kids being taken away from their families for various spurious reasons. I'm hearing plenty of stories in Scotland of kids being taken away from families for spurious reasons. But the problem is that they never get published, because if you're the parent in that situation, there's legal proceedings going on. You're not in a position to be open about it, even if the legal procedures are finished and you've been let off the hook completely. Are you going to want to be publicising that? No, you don't want your kids labelling with that, you don't want your kids' name in it, you don't want your family name in the newspaper. So I've had personal conversations with a few people, really very, very concerning stories about this. But it's difficult to publicise it. But then that's right, I think looking at the way this is playing out in Sweden in particular, and Norway is very valuable. And some things do get through and get translated, and enlightening.
I also worry that it's one of the words that was used most tonight by the guest speaker was professional and professionals. And I worry about how professional these professionals actually are nowadays, you know, because like they're trying to slip people into schools, putting out literature to parents where you would assume that the person was a psychologist when they're not. They're someone who's done a short course
Yeah.
and is now there in a room, a free
Yeah.
room to speak to children. And I just think that it's not just schools, it's not just kids, it's all aspects of our lives. The
Yeah.
grip
Yeah.
of the government is tightening around, you know.
I think there's different sort of areas. I mean, if your car needs fixing, you get a professional car mechanic, then they know how to fix cars because there's one way to do it and they'll do it the right way. But when it comes to how to parent, I think there isn't really one professional view. It's not like physics where there's one theory that's been tested and everyone knows this is the one way that works. It just isn't like that.
Yeah, and we managed for thousands of years without it.
And once people start thinking that they have got the one right way of doing it, then if you've got a bit of power as well, then the temptation is to impose it on everyone else, which is exactly what's happening and what we're fighting against. I will stick to our published time, but I'll just finish with a couple of things very quickly. Yeah, I can stop that, yeah.